And with any luck, people will be able to see my screen and still hear me and see a title slide right now saying Regional Official Plan Review. Is this correct? Yep, good. I see some nodding, so that's, and I hear at least one yes, that's fine, perfect. Great, well, good evening and welcome and thank you for coming. My name is Kevin Thomason. I'm one of the co-founders of Smart Growth Waterloo Region. That's actually a community group that was founded back in about 2012 when the last regional official plan actually ran into a lot of trouble in the courts. And we in the community felt that there needed to be a lot more community understanding of this very complex legal morass we were in at the time, and had to try to figure out how to engage our community in ensuring we got the best possible outcomes for the future. And the good news with that was in 2015, we succeeded in getting our visionary regional official plan approved. And so where our current situation is that the next regional official plan update is currently underway. And these things happen about every 10 years. And this one, though, has been lengthened by Doug Ford to a length of 30 years. So this will really determine our vision, our priorities, and the form of our community. And it determines what we protect, what we destroy, how we get around, how we're going to address climate change. There's so many things that are contained in the regional official plan. It's really the blueprint for everything in our region. And it's a shame that it's being so rushed right now with very little opportunity for public input. Our last regional official plan created our countryside line concept, the protected countryside, light rail transit, and the core renewals we see in Waterloo and Kitchener, and so many other bold, innovative concepts that really we now take for granted, and even just a few years later can't imagine our community without. This next ROP update needs to be just as bold and visionary if we're going to succeed in the years ahead. However, planning for the future is not easy. Climate change, as we know, is the most significant threat facing our community, and every decision has huge impact. As I mentioned, there's been a fraction of the public engagement, consultation, or even media coverage on this ROP compared to previous official plans, and we need far more time for public input and just even to understand the implications of what's being proposed. The current situation right now is regional staff are proposing 3 different growth options for the future, 3 different scenarios that our future could be. However, all may be overly complicated and insufficient to meet future needs, particularly in light of the fact that we've got these commitments to reduce our greenhouse gases by 80% by 2050 within the time frame of this 2051 official plan. Option number 1 has massive amounts of urban sprawl, huge farmland loss, likely breaches our countryside line in numerous places, and would abandon the goals of regional sustainability and leadership. Option number 2 still destroys almost 1,000 acres of local farmland and creates complex inequity issues between municipalities. In the past, Ken Sealing always treated each of our municipalities equally. Option number 2 gives some growth and others not, and that's going to be a big change from anything we've ever seen in the past. Option number 3 is overly complex, very difficult to achieve the way it focuses on density, and puts too much of that density at the periphery or the very edge of our communities, rather than throughout or in the core of our communities, as we normally expect with density. So because we had 3 options that weren't really workable or even viable or that appealing, a large group of community groups and organizations, professional planners and such have got together and created an option number 4. And this is a simpler, more congruent 4th option that's based on current trends and the rates of intensification that we've been seeing. It's got no boundary expansion and no farmland loss, so very similar to what Hamilton or Halton have decided, that they're going to stay within their boundaries and no longer sprawl on a farmland. This manages to achieve the same. And it buys us time to see how a post-pandemic world unfolds without locking us into sprawl. Why designate lands when it's not going to be needed for decades, as is desired under some of these growth options, number 1 or 2. And it treats all area municipalities equally. So just looking at a little chart here, and this gets a little technical, but you can see option number 1 is here. It's kind of Doug Ford's mandated land needs analysis, the provincial formula that is really using 1970s market forecasting to predict massive amounts of sprawl. It's basically saying the best way to predict the future and the homes you'll need is how many homes you built in the 70s and 80s. The issue with this is we know that the 70s and 80s are unsustainable, and that can't be our future. It would see about 5,500 acres of additional farmland lost for sprawling subdivisions. Option number 2 is much better. It's got a higher intensification rate and higher density, and therefore the amount of land needed falls to just under 1,000 acres. But still, in a climate crisis, we can't afford to lose even 1,000 acres of farmland. So option number 3 bumps up the density. As I mentioned, the density at the periphery, unfortunately, which is really difficult. And we don't actually have to take over any farmland. We've already designated so much land. Kitchener right now has 20,000 building permits and 20,000 lots sitting already designated, registered, and ready to go, but unbuilt. That's literally decades worth of land supply there. So because we've over designated so much, we can use some of that up and also do the intensification and the things in our core areas that we're seeing so successful. But one of the challenges I mentioned, option number 3, is density gets too high. So, and we've focused option number 4 on more intensification rates like what we're seeing already. As I say down here, intensification rate very congruent with our current rate of about 68, almost 70% right now. Lowered the density down so it's a little more achievable, and we're still able to stay with 0 acres of farmland loss. So there's been a lot of meetings about this. It was on April 12th that the Regional Council unveiled these 3 growth options and released them. Unfortunately, the only public engagement that happened was there were 2 webinars on April 22nd and the 25th that were just online webinars hosted by the region. There's about 20, 25 people maybe attend each one. But given this plan, it's the 30-year plan for 600,000 people, we should have every person speaking up for the future that they want to see. They did on April 29th what they call their all-council meeting, which is where all the municipal and all the regional councillors all gather for one giant meeting, and they reviewed the ROC then. So for most of our municipal councillors, that was the first chance they got to see this regional plan. Then on May 18th, at Regional Council was our chance for public feedback, and we had 24 delegations there, all giving some pretty clear and pretty pointed feedback that option 1 to 3 weren't sufficient, and option 4 looked to be by far the best way to go, and that we needed more time and just more public engagement and consultation. May 27th was the deadline for public feedback and submissions, if you wanted to send emails or letters or that sort of thing. But they're still ongoing with the municipal feedback. So on May 24th, Wellesley Council was the very first one. They had a staff report released and held their council meeting, in which their councillors actually unanimously rejected their staff recommendation for option number 2. They deliberated for a number of hours and realized they weren't going to get anywhere that night, and they requested a second special council meeting be set up, which is actually starting in 3 minutes in Wellesley Council chambers tonight. On May 30th, Kitchener Council had a meeting. They too had a staff report released in which the staff report was unable to come to a conclusion or a recommendation on option 1, 2, or 3, and left it to the councillors to try to figure out how they wanted to handle this. The Kitchener councillors debated for several hours that afternoon, took a break, debated again for several hours that evening, and finally realized that they needed a second meeting. That meeting is actually going to be happening tomorrow afternoon, but they've already now scheduled a third meeting for that. Wilmot Council met on May 30th as well, the same day as Kitchener. They too had a staff report that made no recommendation for option 1, 2, or 3 because their staff said there wasn't enough information and they had found some serious errors in some of the options. Their councillors deliberated for hours on what to do and came to the conclusion that they too needed a second meeting on it. Last night, June 6th in North Dumfries, they had their council meeting on it, and they listened to our option number 4, talked about it for an hour, but unfortunately went with option number 2, which in their township, I have to admit, it's only 59 hectares or less than 100 acres of growth they're looking for the next 30 years. So it's a pretty small amount of farmland lost. It's kind of a rounding error in many other municipalities. So it's not a critical crisis. They were basically of the opinion that with every single acre of of their township being targeted for destruction from aggregates and gravel pits. At least losing a farm to housing was a positive thing compared to a gravel pit. So it was a bit of a negative outlook they had, but you can't blame them in some ways when you see the amount of gravel onslaught they're under. Last night at Woolwich was their council meeting, and there, interestingly, there was a staff report for recommending option number 2, which had hundreds of acres of farmland lost for a lot of new growth in Elmira and down around Breslau, potentially even out at Maryhill as well. And interestingly, their councillors voted unanimously against their staff recommendation and unanimously for approval of option number 4's principles with no farmland loss. So huge there to have almost half of the farmland the region is allocating or offering under option number 2 was going to Woolwich. And here is Woolwich Council saying, no, we don't want it. We are in a climate crisis. We can't afford farmland loss, and we need to live more sustainably. So very interesting meeting in Woolwich there last night. Tonight, as I mentioned, Wellesley is having their second council meeting in which their new staff report is being brought forward, which instead of recommending option number 2, this time is recommending the principles in option number 4, very much like we saw in Woolwich and we've seen in Kitchener and such. There's a little bit of minor farmland loss in Wellesley, just simply because they're the only municipality that doesn't really have a land bank of any land. They're pretty much out of things. And somehow it's a whopping 20 hectares, 20 to 25 hectares are looking for, so a very, very small amount. So it's kind of hard to argue how we're going to be doomed under climate change by seeing 20 hectares developed. On the other hand, still every acre of farmland counts, but it's been very encouraging to see them adopt pretty much every option 4 principle. Upcoming meetings, tomorrow we have Kitchener Council coming forward with a new staff report and their second council meeting now based on option number 4's principles, hopefully advocating for no farmland loss, and fingers crossed we'll see a motion carried forward and succeed there. On Monday, June 13th, we have Wilmot have their second council meeting. They too have a motion coming forward based on the principles in option number 4 with no farmland loss, which would be a big accomplishment for Wilmot. And then in June 13th, we have the City of Waterloo Council coming forward with a very good staff report there that then again, have already worked in some of the option 4, and there's councillors ready to move motions to bring in even more of option 4's sustainability principles. And then again, stressing no farmland loss. And of course, as we know, the City of Waterloo is already staying within their existing boundaries. They've already built out pretty much their boundaries and have been building up instead of out for about 10 years already. And they're really much the poster child, showing that, you know, you do a little bit like the island of Manhattan in New York City, they haven't had a new acre of farmland in 100 years, and yet they still remain one of the most thriving, dynamic, rapidly growing and desirable places to live in the world. So just because you run out of farmland to pave over doesn't mean that the world comes to the end or you stop growing. You just start to grow in different ways. And this is perhaps the most important date that we need to talk about, which is the June 22nd date. Originally, this was June 15th, but the other day, the region bumped it out a week and has given these municipalities an extra week longer to respond. And that will be when the region comes down from the mount with the tablets to unveil the chosen growth option based on the feedback that they've heard from citizens, from all these municipal councils and everyone else, of what is the chosen growth option that they will be recommending to regional councillors. Then looking forward into the crystal ball a little bit here, we don't know what date the regional council is actually going to choose or vote on the recommended growth option, although we do know that on July 13th, they're having a statutory public open house under Section 26 of the Planning Act. They have to have an open house on the 13th, and then on the 20th, they're going to have their statutory public meeting on the ROP update. And then on August 18th, it will come to a final vote at regional council. And then August 19th, the reason they've pushed it as far as they could to the 18th, August 19th is when nominations close for the municipal elections. And depending on the number of councillors resigning or not returning, there's a chance that council could become a lame duck council. If you fall below a majority and you do not have a majority returning, you become a lame duck council, and you're not, in essence, able to make any decision until the new council is reconvened and reconstituted in what would be probably mid-November or sometime along there. So anyways, the next step and what we're here for tonight is really to figure out what needs to happen on this June 22nd meeting. And we have seen the challenges we've had over the last few weeks in the municipal councils of a lot of very confused and upset and irate councillors trying to figure out with incomplete information a plan for the next 30 years. Large portions of this plan is irrevocable, and once we're locked into it, we're locked into it. And really, with only 8 years until 2030, when we have to have a 50% reduction in our greenhouse gases, this regional official plan will determine if we can hit those Paris Accord targets. And so really, this is our chance to speak up if we want more bold visionary leadership and climate action. And we're wondering if we need to be packing this June 22nd meeting with 100+ delegations to send a very strong message from the community on the importance of climate change, the importance of climate change action, and making sure we're doing things. I think there's a lot of frustration and even confusion at times amongst our councillors. They've all declared these climate emergencies. They've all made these ambitious goals to cut gases by 50% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. But then they've actually done very little towards actually achieving this. And even when we see some of these plans being brought forward, they're not ambitious enough to meet these targets. And so this is where we really need to be encouraging the region for more bold and visionary leadership. We really need to be getting them off of any talk of option number 1 and a half that the developers are currently trying to get them to, option number 2, and really get them to option number 3 or 4, which are these bold visionary plans with the no farmland loss. So anyways, I'll stop my screen sharing so we can all see each other a little better here. And I don't know, Steph, if we want to have a bit of a discussion to try to figure out now the best path forward. But I think very much we want to try to figure out why you're here, what your motivations and desires are if you represent a particular group or such, and somehow see if we can come up with a bit of a community plan on how are we going to respond to this regional official plan, and how can we inspire more action on climate change and bigger, bolder, more visionary actions. Does that make sense, Steph?
Yes, it does. Absolutely. So is there any questions? I see one person asking about signing up to delegating. So I think there's a lot of information that Kevin kind of threw in there. Do we have any questions that want to have answered before the next step after this would be that we're going to ask people to kind of talk about how they see themselves or a group that they're with related to the regional official plan, or what they're motivated by. So let's just, open up for questions. Go ahead, Shane.
Hi, thanks. Kevin, can you explain to us again, who may have missed that in the rush, what happens with Doug Ford? What is the relationship to all of this with the province? Why did the province move? Well, do we know why the province moved this to a 30-year plan, and what the rush is?
Yeah. Quite simply, this is Doug Ford's strategy to lock as much land in for urban sprawl for his developer buddies as possible. And we see some of the patterns that we've seen too frequently with our provincial government, where if they rush things, there isn't time to organize a resistance, there isn't time for consultation, and they can force you to use their methodology, which is very similar to what we saw in the election. As little as public dialogue as possible, as little consultation as possible, as much time with their buddies as possible, skew the rules so they're in favor. So he's rewritten parts of the provincial policy statement, rewritten parts of the Planning Act, rewritten the land needs assessment formula to mandate that we look at these 1970s models and use what they call market analysis, which says the best way to predict the future is from the past. And yet we all know with climate change, the past is what's got us into this, and we've got to do things differently. And if you go back back to the 2009 regional official plan that we had that was so progressive. Developers appealed every single word of that plan for 6 years. They fought at the OMB, at the OLT, and finally we took the OMB itself to the Supreme Court of Ontario and raked them before a judge. And all of that was over the land needs assessment formula. And then again, the province was saying, and all the developers saying, you need to use our outdated formulas that over-predict urban sprawl. And that's why when you go to Mississauga or Durham or Markham or whatever, you see nothing and the sprawl as far as the eye can see. And the region was different. The region said, no, we need to be more sustainable. We want to revitalize our core areas. We have this plan for rapid transit. And we think trends are changing. You know, we think seniors and boomers are going to act differently. We think young people want to live in walkable communities and we know the future is going to be different. And so what happened and what those 6 years of court battles was arguing over whose forecasting was right. And in the end, the divisional court said, look, only time is going to tell whose forecast is right. But we think the region is onto something with their predictions of looking into the future to forecast demand rather than only using past historical trends to forecast demand. And what the divisional court ended up doing was ruling in between. And they said, we're not going to give you the 1,100 hectares that the developers wanted. We're not going to only give you the 56 hectares that the region wanted. We're going to compromise on 250. So 5 times what the region wanted, but 1/5 of what the developers wanted. And they said, in the end, we'll have a mediated solution, but you're going to have to use the region's formulas because we think the region's actually onto something. So the developers agreed to use the region's formula. They got 5 times more than the region was going to give them, but only 1/5 of what they wanted. And that was the settlement in 2015, and we finally moved forward. The good news is now it's been 13 years since 2009, and we can see using data whose forecasting is right. And it turns out the region's forecasts are almost bang on within 1% on almost everything. And the province's forecasts are so comically off, it's actually hilarious on some of the graphs and charts just to see how far they're off. You know, they're still predicting massive amounts of suburban homes needed for the city of Waterloo, despite the fact the city of Waterloo has run out of land to build any of those homes on. They're still predicting 60% of all building permits in the city of Waterloo will be for single family detached homes. So the good news is time is showing that Waterloo is right. We still have a premier, though, who is demanding that people use this outdated market forecast and land needs assessment. And we could be up for a battle in the future moving forward. And so you ask of how we got to where we are. This is where we're at. We need to encourage our region to be bold and visionary and once again, kind of break the mold. But the advantage we've got here is Hamilton and Halton have also broken the mold and see a path forward. And we're in a climate emergency. The other thing working in our favor right now, Shane, is we've been tremendously successful. Our uptown core revitalization, LRT, all those bold things that we gambled on in the last drop have worked out so well. It's kind of hard imagining going back to the way we were before them. So we have some pretty strong arguments this time if the developers try to challenge us and drag us off to divisional courts or the OMB or OLT. And they're doing that. They were in council chambers last night in Woolwich. We saw 13 different delegations from developers, all asking for their lands or farms to be paved and all threatening that they're, the sky will fall or they'll have the province or the minister come in and do it for us if we don't. But we saw then again, bold councillors in Wellesley make some decisions last night to ignore the demands of their own staff and every single developer to go with no farmland loss. I see Steph and I see Lyle and Claudia.
No, I'm just making sure I remind you about time.
I know,
Lyle,
I know. Sorry, and I'm trying to pack as much context as I can in here. So,
Lyle,
yeah,
go ahead.
Yep, Lyle.
Thanks for this, Kevin. I'm wondering if you could comment on the financial implications, or has any work been done on what the financial implications are to municipal coffers? We know a significant amount of township income or municipal income comes from development charges, and I realize that yes, building up also spurs some development charges, but not to the extent of new greenfield development. So has there been any effort made to sort of cost? Like I guess that's the problem I have when I see these recommendations. There's no dollars and cents attached to it, and we don't, to the information, we have no idea if what's what's being reckoned for these things are even financially viable to our townships. And most of us aren't prepared to pay double the municipal property tax to compensate. So, I mean, without that, it's really hard to say, jump on the wagon here.
That's right. No, excellent and really important questions. First of all, we know that growth doesn't pay for itself, and it turns into be a giant Ponzi scheme. You have to keep getting new growth and pave over new farm fields to try to pay the bills on the previous farm fields that you already paved over and put sidewalks and sewers and all the infrastructure and fire halls and street lights and all sewage plants and everything else that's needed. And that's actually one of the big problems in the GTA, and why the norm in the GTA, when you go to Mississauga or York or Durham or whatever, is averages of 6 to 8% tax increases each year, is they've got to cover all the costs of all the sprawl development that doesn't cover itself. It's basically, it costs $1.41 for each new dollar of tax revenue using sprawl development. So it's a losing proposition, and it's a downward spiral. This is where the more sustainable growth, where you're looking at intensification within an existing town where you've already got existing arterial roads, you've already got sewers. Yeah, you might need to upgrade a sewer line or something like that, but it's still going to be a lot cheaper than having to provision everything from scratch. Is a lot more affordable and sustainable. And it's unfortunate that we were at least getting to the point where development charges were getting better at capturing the true costs of growth. Unfortunately, one of the changes that Doug Ford made under the guise of housing affordability was to limit what municipalities could charge for development charges and skew everything again to try to make single-family homes misleadingly cheaper by having the other forms of people, and more often existing taxpayers, subsidizing things. So we do have a bit of a skewed landscape. Now, the region is working on a financial formula and a financial costing of each of these options. They're also working on an environmental impact and a carbon budget or carbon accounting costing of each of these impacts. Sadly, they're not coming out until June 22nd. So the night in which they're making their final decision is the night in which they're releasing all the data that presumably would have been really helpful to have to make these decisions. But it just speaks to, then again, the rush that we're in. Because Doug Ford wasn't sure if he would win this last election or not, he put in an arbitrary July 1st deadline for all the municipalities in the province to have these, what they call the municipal comprehensive reviews, or these official plans done. So we've got every jurisdiction in the province madly scrambling to make these July 1st deadlines to meet this arbitrary date of Ford. And then again, it was just Ford's strategy of rush things, push people through, they're more likely to get the outcomes. And because this is a 30-year plan now, instead of just a 10 or 20-year plan, you're going to over-designate and lock in more sprawl. And of course, the challenge with development land is once you designate that land for development, once you give a developer the right or permission to develop that farm or piece of land, you can't revoke it back without buying back those development rights at the cost of the profits that the developers would lose. So it's a one-way street. We can designate it anytime, but we can't ever get it back. And that's one of the nice things with the option number 4 that we're proposing is, because of the way the official plans are done, there's a mandatory review every 5 years. So every 5 years, we've got to look and see, were our predictions right or wrong? And if we're off at any point, we can always add more land then. But why add land now when we can't even predict how many people are going back to the office next week because of the pandemic? How can we possibly predict what office space needs are going to be in 2047 or 2050 or something? So this is one of the nice things with our option 4 is it buys time and allows us to basically use a bit of a placeholder by staying on our current trajectory of intensification and make more decisions along the way as we get better data, better information, and that sort of thing, and just see how the future works out. So hopefully that answers some of your concerns, Lyle, and on that. Shane, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I might be a bit rebellious here. What happens if the regional government could be convinced to tell the province to stuff it and deny their July 1st deadline?
They're already kind of doing that because, yeah, and you saw on the timeline that I showed you some July 20th and August 18 dates that were there. The region is already kind of saying to Doug Ford, look, we're not going to make your July 1st deadline, but you're going to your cottage, Doug, for the whole summer, and you're not going to notice if we don't do anything until September. So give us the summer to work on things, and by the time you get back on Labor Day weekend, we'll have it all done. So, then again, they're also trying to draw that, get it done while we've got the council there that we know and that is up on these things. Because and this is something we've even debated about in the community, is are we better to do what Aurelia just did last week? Aurelia just said, this is ridiculous. We're killing ourselves on this official plan. And they literally added 1 year. Instead of June 9th, 2022 as their deadline, they made it June 9th, 2023. And they just added a full year to it. And that could be a possibility here. But if we're suddenly looking at new municipal councils and a new regional council, are we better with the devils we know or the devils we don't know? Because if developers should suddenly get a whole bunch of people elected, where we may have rather progressive councillors or such in place now, we might not want to extend into November, December, January. Not to mention, if you're a new councillor, there's a lot to learn. The complexities of an official plan are staggering. To have to try to learn that in your first few months could be kind of scary. So it's a really tough call of, do we meet July 1st, September 1st, December 1st, next June 1st? There's pros and cons to each. Yes, Steph. Or Lyle, is your hand back up, or is that from before?
Oh, I am back. I just wanted to follow up on the finances a little bit. At the Township of Wilmot meeting the other night, we heard Harold, Mr. Okafka, say that the options 2 and 3 would not meet their current 10-year capital forecast projection. So they would either, something would have to happen. Either projects would have to be eliminated, delayed, or so I'm confused then how these capital items that are on the docket, how they're going to be paid for with the lack of development charges.
Yeah, and part of that is simply how many people should we be adding to Wilmot in the future? Under option 1, it would be adding 10,400 people to Wilmot, which is basically doubling the population of the township. That's a pretty big amount of growth over the years ahead. Whereas under option 2 and 3, there's a lesser number assigned simply because we're not paving over as much farmland, and there's a more limited ability to potentially fit these people into existing towns or within an existing footprint. So instead of 10,400 people, we see a 7,000 number and a 6,100 number for that. And this is part of the discussion, the decisions we have to have moving forward, is just how much growth do we want to see in our communities? And what Harold's referring to there is they were always planning for much larger numbers of even as high as 13,000 in Wilmot, even though it's beyond the capacity of the sewage plant. If we have less people come, yes, we're going to have less development charges, but we're also going to have a heck of a lot less expenses that we're going to have to incur. And this comes back to that development Ponzi scheme and where I was actually talking to a City of Waterloo councillor today, because City of Waterloo is no longer on that Ponzi scheme and is no longer counting on paving over farmland and new development paying for previous development. The question was what can other municipalities in the region learn from Waterloo? And can the City of Waterloo actually lend its staff, lend its CFO, lend its people, administrators to some of these other municipalities to help them come up with models for the future on the same transition that Waterloo did about 8 years ago to a far more sustainable form of growth? And this is really part of the whole climate change question. It's not just reducing our greenhouse gases. It's about how do we come up with the procedures and the systems and the financial infrastructure to live more sustainably in the future as well. This is all part of the learning and all part of what's got to happen in that transition.